Hello, and welcome to Enhanced Information Solutions webinar on hardening your OT infrastructure. I'm Jack Audie, EIS's Director of Sales, and your host for this webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all registrants. Here's the agenda for today. First, we'll have a poll, followed by an introduction of EIS and then an introduction of SteelCloud. Introduce you to the speakers, and then we will proceed with the demo, and we will proceed with the presentation and include a demo of the SteelCloud product. So before we get started, here's some of the Zoom basics. You'll see there's a selection there for a Q&A. You can click on there and you can ask questions. We will answer them at the end. At the end, please take the survey. It will appear in the browser at the end of the webinar. We appreciate it because this way it'll help us gauge the value of this webinar and help us to produce a better product. Our first speaker is Joe Cody. Joe, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. I'm Joe Cody with Enhanced Information Solutions, the webinar host. I lead the OT Cybersecurity and Network Services team. So I've been around a while. I have a background in both IT and OT. So I've done software development. I've worked with PLCs, control systems, a little bit of everything. I like to tell people that I kind of exist in the brackish waters between IT and OT. So I can kind of speak fluently in both of those. I got my start with a classical education from the U.S. Navy. Their nuclear propulsion program, and then the civilian world, I moved up and got a couple of degrees from Purdue University.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Nigel, please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, everybody, and good evening. I think we've got somebody over in Ireland, so glad to be here. I'm Nigel Hughes. I'm a Vice President here at SteelCloud, and I'm excited to present our automated policy compliance solution, ConfigOS, today. So eager to get going.
Okay, thank you. We're going to launch a poll, and please complete the poll, and we'll share the results.
So Nigel, while people are taking the poll, I wanted to ask you, so for those, it should become obvious for folks here, but EIS, SteelCloud are different operating companies, and we work with SteelCloud very closely. But I think, Nigel, we probably came at the system hardening problem from two different directions, right? I think you guys probably came at it from the compliance and regulatory side first, whereas we came at it from a pure hardening perspective, right? We wanted to harden systems independent of regulation. So as we start kind of meeting in the middle, and you start dealing with customers who maybe don't have a regulatory requirement to harden, what would you say to those guys, those customers, about why you should go ahead and move forward with regulation?
Yeah,
or excuse me, with hardening.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and there's standards that I think give us direction, they give us boundaries, they give us goals, and I think to subscribe to a standard for compliance, even without a mandate, demonstrates that you've got good cyber hygiene standards and practices that will protect your networks. I think there's an enormous amount of energy and investment that goes into establishing these standards, and since they're there and they're free and they're easy to subscribe to, we think there's no better way to be able to lock down your infrastructure and be able to validate that you've done it to a certain standard.
Agree. The other thing we always preach, right, is I don't think it's a matter of if, but when you're going to be asked to comply with some of these various things, whether it's software bill of materials or system hardening. And I always advise customers, get ahead of that curve, right? You never want to wait until the federal government or the EU shows up your door and says, hey, you have to get compliant with these and you got to do it in 1 year or 18 months. My suggestion is always get ahead of that curve. And in general, I've found that regulators and auditors are way more lenient with you when they see that you're already making an effort or you're already striving towards a goal, especially a standard like STIG or CIS, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But when you're already working towards those, they tend to be, the leash tends to be a lot longer with those guys.
Yeah, I think that's true. And what we're starting to see, especially in the sort of critical infrastructure space, we had the pipeline incident a year or two ago. The TSA, part of Homeland Security now is kind of getting close and exploring these types of incidents and trying to make recommendations around best practices without being too heavy-handed. CISA is certainly exploring ensuring that the operators of these pipelines, the critical infrastructure around railway transportation, sea, all of these types of supply chains should subscribe to some kind of a security standard that will protect them from these nefarious bad actors, these malware types of attacks, and be able to protect these networks.
Okay.
How are we doing on the poll, Jack?
Well, we're done. I'm sharing that. Do y'all see do y'all see the polls?
Yes.
Okay. So the question is, what industry? Other. Not everyone completed the poll, but that's fine. Well, what security policies do you follow today? A little bit of STIG, a little bit of NIST, and a little bit of something else. What percentage of your IoT systems exist in a domain? 50 to 75%. And what vendors do you have in your OT network, in your OT environment, and it's something else? All right. Thank you very much. So what we do now is talk a little bit about who is Enhanced Information Solutions. And it never fails when I schedule a webinar, they decide to mow my lawn. So that's what you hear in the background. EIS was founded almost 30 years ago in Stillwater, Minnesota. We provide MES consulting and implementation services, PI services, SEEK services, and of course, OT cybersecurity. We have 3 products: eDataSheet for manual data entry into PI. We have OpsTracker product for electronic logbook with workflow and a complete audit trail. And PI Event Frame Manager allows you to create and edit PI event frames. We're a global company. You can see that these are our brick and mortar offices located in Stillwater, Minnesota, Toronto, Canada, San Juan, Puerto Rico, Dublin, Ireland, Mannheim, Germany, Pune, India, and Istanbul, Turkey. Joe, could you talk to this slide, please?
Sure. So the one disclaimer I'll throw out is I never just read from my slides. Jack can tell you I never do the same presentation twice. So a lot of these, I'll kind of highlight the important stuff on it. So this is pretty much what we use to pay the bills, guys. The 2 areas here I really want to highlight those, obviously system protection, because that's where the system hardening kind of goes into. We're going to talk about today, along with things like endpoint protection, anti-malware, those type things. And then the other one worth looking at is patch management. We do a lot of work around OT patch management, and patch management really goes hand in hand with system hardening. Next slide, Jack. Nigel, you want to tell us a little bit about SteelCloud?
Yes, I'd be delighted to. So SteelCloud is a software company. We have a commercial off-the-shelf product called ConfigOS, and its purpose is to automate policy compliance. And by that, I specifically mean STIG compliance and CIS compliance. We tend to spend our time working with OT and IT infrastructure, and the requirements, of course, for each of those differ markedly. For OT compliance, there often are requirements really for auditing, accrediting different systems and capturing compliance posture. So that's something that we do extremely well. One of the things about our ConfigOS solution is that it's agentless, which is really preferred by the OT community in as much as it doesn't require any changes to their operating environment. We do support thousands of policy controls for OSs and things like databases and web servers and browsers and firewalls and what have you. And all of these have zero impact for OT infrastructure. There are, of course, in addition to controls that can be automated, the manual ones, those documentation items, and they're all included in our coverage. We also integrate with SIM platforms, including Splunk, and we also work with ITSM such as ServiceNow. Many of our customers use our product to accredit to these mandated standards, and they also use it independently of these standards, as we discussed earlier, in order to get to ATOs and sustain their own internal audit requirements. So that's a little bit about us, and I'll get more into that as we get to our demo.
All right, so real quick, make sure everybody's taking notes on the acronyms. There will be a test at the end of the webinar. You need to pass with 80% or greater. Shouldn't be that difficult. So one of the things I always like to start a webinar with is a definition. I feel like I suffer from imposter syndrome, so providing a definition from a reputable source makes it sound like I really know what I'm talking about. In this case, we'll use a definition from NIST. They define hardening as a process intended to eliminate a means of attack by patching vulnerabilities and turning off non-essential services. And that comes right out of NIST Special Publication 800 TAC 152. Now, as I said earlier, I highlighted patching. We're going to talk about that separately, not in this webinar. Patching, especially in OT, we handle that as a separate program because it is so involved. There's so much to do there. We're really going to worry about the non-essential services, but in system hardening, we need to go beyond just the non-essential services when we talk about eliminating all those means of attack that they're looking at there. So when we do hardening, there's a lot of different things we do broadly. We turn off services, like they said. We disable ports for the firewall. We'll lock down the BIOS. We'll increase the logging on the system so that we know when administrators are logging in, various accounts are coming in and out, things are being accessed in the system, and there's a slew of other things. Now, for our purposes, we're going to define system hardening as just a process of applying settings and controls to a computer system in order to reduce its attack surfaces. For Windows, those settings and controls are typically registry settings, PowerShell scripts, group policies or local security policies. Linux, that could be a configuration file, could be a configuration file on a switch. Database, it could be a setting in a database. There's all components that go into hardening. And for this conversation, we're really going to focus on operating systems. Pretty much everybody works with operating systems. They're familiar with them. And in particular, we're going to pay attention to the Windows operating system. Again, hardening covers so many other things, but in the interest of time, we're just going to focus on operating systems here. Next slide, please. So what kind of benefits do we get out of system hardening? Well, number one, the biggest benefit is increased security. What we're really looking to do when we do system hardening is reducing the attack surface of the system. We want to give bad guys fewer vectors to exploit our system. If we're not using a particular service, particular port, turn it off. That way, bad guy can't get into it. The net result is we have greater security. That's obviously the biggest thing. One of the things that's not so obvious that we have from doing system hardening is we increase the performance of the system. Now, I'm a Linux guy, so I frequently throw shade at Microsoft every opportunity I get. If you guys feel it to be gratuitous, feel free to call me out on it. But a lot of systems, not just Microsoft, they've got a lot of stuff running in the background that you potentially don't need. And so each one of these, even if they're not doing much other than just sitting there, they still consume resources. They're taking up memory, they're taking up disk space, they're taking up CPU time. And so when we go through hardening and we turn these things off or we disable them, we free those resources up. And that results in increased performance in the system. And the other big benefit, especially in regulated environments, is you have better compliance and audit response. And I don't mean just by complying with the audit, but the fact that you're reducing the number of applications, the number of accounts, things like that. There's fewer things to keep track of. So when the auditors come in and ask questions or want to look at your system, it's a smaller subset of data that you have to have. Next slide, please, Jack. So how are we going to go about this, and what are we looking to, right? We look at, as I said, these are typically settings, especially in Windows. Well, a quick check in an Active Directory domain from Windows 2016, there are over 4,000 group policy settings. So if we were to go through a network of, say, 20 of these, 20 systems, we would need to apply every single one of these on every machine. And then the other thing we have to be careful about is these settings, especially in OT, can sometimes break things. In particular, the applications running on the machine. If we turn off a service or we turn off something running in the background that the application we needed to run, that setting will break that. And so it's a little bit of an iterative process. There's some intelligence that's involved in this to make sure that we don't break the machine or turn it into a paperweight. So how do we do that? What do we, what kind of intelligence we use that? Well, in reality, we don't need to know these things. The truth of the matter is that there's some very sharp people out there working for agencies like Microsoft and Rockwell and the Department of Defense or CISA that have come up with standards to do this. And the two most popular ones are STIG and CIS, and that's what we're going to talk about a lot today. Next slide, please. So STIG stands for Security Technical Implementation Guide. That is predominantly a Department of Defense standard. That's what it originated out of. If you're working with the Department of Defense or you're DoD adjacent, as we like to say it, you're maybe a company that works with a DoD company, STIG is going to be your way to go. The other standard, CIS, is Center for Internet Security. This really kind of originated out of civilian systems and local governments. And I find it to be a little more IT focused. Both of these standards cover all kinds of different systems and applications, like we said, operating systems, network devices, databases, so forth. And they have different levels. So they have, level 1, 2, 3, or category 1, 2, and 3. So they depend on your particular situation, you may need to comply with a different level or choose to comply with a different level. In OT systems, really either of these will apply. Again, regulations not requiring. But in our experience, we found that the closer you get to level 0 of the Purdue model, so where the actual devices and controllers are, we tend to find STIG works a little bit better. We have to create fewer deviations, fewer exceptions than CIS. Now, as you move up towards the business systems into like the OT DMZs and things like that, I think CIS becomes a little more valid or a little better choice, as it tends to be a little more IT flavored. And then what we find, especially outside of regulated environments, a lot of sites or enterprises will adopt their own standard. And a lot of times it's just a subset or an amalgam of STIG, right? So they'll take STIG, for example, or take CIS, and they'll go through it and they'll turn off all of the stuff related to DCOM because now we don't want to apply that. It might break some things. So they'll create their own subset. Next slide, please. So how do you actually go through and implement this? Well, as I mentioned earlier, fundamentally, both of these are just simply registry settings, PowerShell scripts, local or global group policies, and that's really all there is to it. So you really can just sit down and go through. There's guides that are published for these, and a couple of good references are the STIG for Dummy and the CIS benchmarks. And it just so happens I actually have one of the OG printed out STIG for Dummies, and I suggest each of you guys take a look at that, especially for STIG. But they print these standards out, and it says, okay, for this particular control, and you'll see some of this when we get into the demo, a password policy. It's got to be at least 14 characters long, and it shows you the local group policy or the registry saying you need to go check that. You can do that on every one of those. But as we've previously mentioned, there are thousands, if not tens of thousands of these to go through. And you have to do this on every system, even using something like group policy to expedite some of it. Some of these still have to be done manually, or there are systems that aren't joined to your Active Directory domain. So really, manual hardening is not feasible for most customers. Next slide, please. So when we started just like most of you guys did. EIS started the same way most of you guys did. We had a project to go do STIG hardening, and we started looking for tools to do it. And so particularly around STIG, we found that there were some really good free tools for checking the settings, for scanning, for auditing, but nothing really for applying them, for going through and doing remediation. Now, conversely, on the CIS side, we found that there were some tools for both audit and remediation, but there was a typical cost associated with that. So, with two different sides of the same coin. And what we found was that most people, they built or downloaded these very complex scripts, usually PowerShell scripts, to apply STIG and CS. And we looked at that. So, okay, well, let's go down that path. And we found a couple of drawbacks. The biggest one is that the scripts are not closed loop. So they go and they do a moment in time, set a bunch of settings, but they don't know when the settings change. For example, if a system moves organizational units or it changes domain membership, the settings can change due to group policy. Or sometimes even something as simple as a Windows update gets applied to a system and it changes a setting on the back end, and you're not aware of that with scripts. So that can lead to some of the problems in the second bullet point there. These scripts can be very complex. And if you're just downloading from the internet and you're not taking the time to go through them, you don't necessarily know, well, maybe the place where I downloaded, they didn't want to set any of the DCOM stuff, and we do, but I didn't catch that. And so a lot of times the first time you realize that, oh, we didn't set what we were supposed to set was when the auditor finds it. And trust me, that's a very uncomfortable feeling when the auditor is the one to discover holes in your script. And then the last thing we found a couple of times when we grab scripts and we run them through VirusTotal is that these scripts are so complex, people really grab them from the internet and don't know much about them. And we found some of the scripts actually had malware injected into them. And so that's obviously a very bad day if you wind up running that. Next slide. So what we ultimately settled on and found was SteelCloud's ConfigOS. So this was a great GUI tool, fully featured, very intuitive for how to do it. As Nigel said, it was agentless, which worked great for us in OT environments where we could scan the network either through a traditional ping sweep, Active Directory query, or just loading up a good old CSV file to get our systems in. Then we could sort it the way we wanted to. We could leave it in the OU structure. We imported it that way. We could sort it out by, okay, these systems are getting CIS, these systems are getting STIG, and we could really organize things we wanted to. Then once we had it organized, we can either globally apply a set of policies to everything in the group, or at any level in the hierarchy, we can break that up. So it's inheritance, right? We can inherit from the very highest level, or an individual system can have its own settings, not just signatures, but things like permissions used to access the machine, all of those various things. With ConfigOS, we could do both scan and remediation. So we could just perform auditing, or we could fix things. And we could tell when group policy was going to conflict with us. That was a big bonus. And we had output reports that we really needed. We could take JSON to import into other utilities. We could integrate it with ServiceNow, and we could even get really nice, rich HTML reports right at the time we ran it. So even before we left the site, we could turn over a preliminary report to the folks on site. And then the biggest part is these signatures, these actual definitions for STIG and CIS are supplied by SteelCloud as part of the subscription. Or they have a tool called the Foundry where we could create, or the customer could create their own signatures themselves. So in that case of customers we talked about who want to create their own policy that's a subset or is completely different from CS or STIG, they can do that with the Foundry. Now, I know I can sit here and preach about the wonders of ConfigOS all day long, but I'm a paid advertiser. And so I thought probably one of the best things would be to do a use case. So Nigel and SteelCloud, they have a really good use case for us. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Nigel, let him talk a little bit about the use case, and then roll right into the demo.
All right, Joe, thank you so much. And what a great advocate you are for our platform. We are so glad to be partnered with the EIS folk. And I have to tell you, they are wonderful people, and they really know this sector probably better than any. So thank you for that, Joe. All right, what I'm going to do now is tell you a little bit about one of our customers from an OT perspective. And this is a major oil and gas organization. They're a sort of Fortune 500 top 50 ranking entity. And they had a requirement that was essentially internally driven. they were looking to implement a standard policy, security policy for all of their OT infrastructure. And they looked at what they were doing internally. They looked at all of the sort of AV products, all of the sort of device protection technologies that they had. And they chose then to kind of explore some of the government standards. Specifically, they looked at STIG and CIS benchmarkers options. And after a lot of time and energy, they actually elected to go with the CIS standard, the Center for Internet Security. And they've now implemented ConfigOS for the deployment of these CIS benchmarks across their entire OT and PCN infrastructure. This is enterprise-wide, and it includes more than 10,000 Windows Server and Linux assets. It's a pretty impressive implementation. Now, the reason that they chose ConfigOS, as Joe indicated, is it's because we don't make any changes to the OT assets themselves. What they said is we cannot deploy any agent-based implementations of any given solution, because that would require that the OT asset would have to approve any changes to that configuration, and that could cost hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars to go through that process with all of the different vendors. So they needed to be able to scan these configurations across their enormous networks and be able to capture those reports. This meant that they also had to work with disconnected infrastructure, air-gapped. These are standalone systems that have no connectivity whatsoever. They still had to capture the compliance posture of those assets and then be able to report that through to their auditors. So they chose to use ConfigOS for that purpose, and we were able to scale. We were able to circumnavigate their networks and topologies of remote systems, standalone configurations, these air-gapped systems, and then present all of that compliance reporting through their SIM. They actually chose to work with Splunk, and all of those reports then were presented to the auditors. A big part of that also included an integration with the ServiceNow, the ITSM platform, so they could then further report on different dashboards and assess their risk. A big issue for them is also to look at ongoing compliance factors. As you know, this is a constantly moving target. The government is hyper-vigilant around any threats, any exposures, any risks, and so the policy is constantly updated to reflect those exposures. And this means that they have to stay current on these compliances, and that's where SteelCloud comes in. So that was a wonderful experience. I'm going to show you a demo now of ConfigOS so you can actually see some of these things in action here. All right. You're looking good there, Joe, but I think we're looking for the home screen for the ConfigOS product. There we go. Fantastic. All right. So what I thought I'd do is just show you a quick overview of our automated STIG and CIS compliance solution, ConfigOS, and give you a sense of how easy it is. And I think Joe presented a picture that while policy compliance is a wonderful thing, you know, it's not easy. There are some challenges, especially around the different approaches that are available to you. You know, I think he explained very well the challenges around group policy, around scripts, and doing this work manually. And what we have here is a simple automated solution that takes you from initial baseline creation right the way through to accreditation. And then as the government changes the policy every month, every 90 days, you're always current. And then this simplifies the process and takes weeks or months out of the accreditation timeline. Now, this product is the command center. This is where we do all the heavy lifting around scanning, around implementation of policy, fixing non-compliances, and capturing all of that reporting. So the first thing we need to do is define your network to our product. So let's go there. And you can see there's three main areas of our screen. I'll let your eyes adjust a little. On the left, you can see we have a network tree, not unlike any other kind of network tree. And you can see I've got some STIG-based assets. There's three groups there, some Windows and Linux. And then I've also got some CIS benchmark assets, similar kinds of configurations with Ubuntu and Red Hat and Microsoft. And then Josh, my colleague, has clicked on the Windows 10 asset, and that presents us on the far right a policy compliance at a glance view. We call it our compliance donut. And then in the middle are the attributes we need to know in order to define the asset to ConfigOS. So we obviously need to know the endpoint name. We need to know how we're going to connect to it. Is it through a host name or an IP address? Which port are we going to use to get there? And this is all running in Microsoft Azure, by the way. Now, in order to make changes to these assets, we must have, in this case, a Windows asset. We must have administrator access or a service account that supports that. And then below, we do support network here, like Cisco IOS XE devices. We have database support, including the SQL Server content. And below there, then we have Linux connection information. This is where we meet the government requirement or the policy requirement of sudo elevating once you've initially logged in. So you log in at one level and then sudo elevate to root once you're actually in. We also meet the government requirement for key-based authentication around Linux platforms. Below there is the SteelCloud created content, the ConfigOS policy container. And in this particular container for this particular asset, you can see that we have these policy standards. These are STIGs for the Windows 10 OS, for Chrome, and for Edge. And what we've done as a vendor is we've productized what the government publishes. So if you look at the CIS content at cis.org or the DISA content for all of the STIG requirements, we've productized what they publish into what we call ConfigOS signatures. And you can see there are three here. And we've documented all of our compliance. Now, in addition to, as Joe said, things like registries, local security policy, advanced audit policy control items, there are also manual controls, documentation items, physical security, and they are all included in what we call a pre-populated checklist. So the content that's in the policy, together with what's included in the checklist, gives you a one-for-one correlation from what the government stipulates with what's included with ConfigOS. So you know exactly where you stand vis-a-vis what the government requires. Now, you can see at the bottom there, we do have a remediation lock option. This is really important for some of our OT-based customers where they don't actually want to make changes to any assets that are OT related because of the integrity of those Rockwell, Honeywell type systems. So in this use case, you would probably check that and prevent that from actually being remediated. Now, in terms of loading your various networks into ConfigOS, we have bulk load capabilities that make it really easy. Here's some of the things we can do. We can actually do an Active Directory scan, and it will present all of those OSs and by OU in the network tree. We can also do a ping sweep, which could include a range of IPs, and then there's also the CSV to be able to capture target assets and be precise in the items you're looking to target. But it's very easy to get things established very quickly. You can also set up groups. That's very easy. Here's an example of a group where you can see all of these workstations here are red, which means they haven't been defined correctly. But I can set up a group very easily. And I just go through this process where I have my group name, and then I can push credentials, for example, from parent to child or parent to all children. I can do that for all of these other database and network gear requirements. And here in my policy container, you can see I've got all of these other ConfigOS signatures for all of the other STIG requirements. So beyond the OS, we've now got Office Suite components, browsers, firewalls, all of this content. There are thousands of controls here. And of course, all of those manual documentation items are included in the corresponding pre-populated checklist content. So that again can be pushed from parent to child or parent to all children. And voila, they go from red to green. They are all now ready to be scanned to be remediated, to have that policy implemented very easily. So it's very straightforward to be able to do all of these things. Now, what I'm going to do is a quick scan of all of these assets. You can see they're at pretty decent levels of compliance here, but we're going to go ahead and perform a scan of these. And this is something that you do across your OT environment. And while the scan is going on, I'm going to explain to you what's going on here. ConfigOS as an application is going to be running on a Windows asset on your network. It's going to reach out to these target assets here, to the IP address or to the host name. It's going to attach itself. It's going to authenticate. Essentially, it's logging on to that particular asset. And then it performs a scan of all of the STIG or CIS settings. So it's actually going to go to those registries. It's going to go to those local security policy settings, those advanced audit policy configuration settings. And it's going to look at the value and compare it to the baseline it created using the ConfigOS baseline tool. It will then determine where we're in compliance and where we're not in compliance, okay? And then it will perform a report for all of that policy compliance. It does also have, and let me stress this, it does also have the ability to remediate any findings. That is to say, change those registries, change those configuration files, and bring them into conformance with the baseline that we created. But as I say, we typically don't do that with OT infrastructure, but you can if it's something that you wish to do. For all of your IT requirements, this product works exactly the same way and is able to bring all of those assets into high levels of compliance. So let's go ahead now and look at our scan report for this Windows 10 workstation, and you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about here. Now, ordinarily, when you look at a Windows 10 workstation and perhaps it hasn't been on the domain or hasn't had any policy compliance work done before, it's probably going to come in at about 32%, something like that. We've remediated or we've implemented policy to this particular workstation, and we're at almost 92%. Now, to do this manually, it will probably take you a good day or so. If you've never done it before, it might take you a little bit longer, but as you get more proficient, you become a bit more efficient. And this means that you're able to do more. However, with ConfigOS, it's done in a little over a minute and a half. So there's tremendous productivity gains there. Now, I'm going to show you some of these policy control settings. I think on the survey that we did, the poll, there is some familiarity with STIG. So I'll take you through some of these particular controls. If you can show me a remediation report, that would be helpful, please, Josh. So here's a remediation that we did earlier, and I wanted to share with you what ConfigOS actually does when it implements policy. Now, in an OT environment, that would not be the case, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what this looks like. Let's look at an item that we've actually changed. So here is one. This is the system must be configured to audit log on, log off, account lockout failures. You can see we have all of the dis and meta tag content here, the rule title, group title, and severity, and what have you. And this particular item you can see is an advanced audit policy configuration control. And the expected value here was a 3. Now, when we scanned, before we remediated, we saw that it was set at 1. So we went ahead and changed the control setting and changed it to a 3. We scanned again, and now the setting is correctly showing a 3. That is basically how we went from 32% to 92% in compliance for this asset. Now, in the OT sector, when you're scanning, you're going to have many controls that are not going to be applicable because of the very nature of what you're doing, and you need to document those. Here's an example of a risk-accepted deviation or non-compliance, a waiver, if you will. Now, this one is a local security policy setting, as you can see. This is the deny log on as a batch job user, right, on domain joined workstations must be configured to prevent access from highly privileged domain accounts. So if we look at the expected value here, we were expecting those domain admins. However, when we scanned, it was blank. In this particular use case, we chose to leave it blank, and then we documented why we did that. And you can see migrating batch job users from domain admin accounts, change schedule for December 2nd, 2023. So that is our mitigation for not having this control in compliance. This is essentially our waiver. And your local ISSM or AO will sign off on that non-compliance, and that becomes part of your baseline. So that's how we handle those deviations. And you'll get many of those, as I say, because most of the OT infrastructure was not designed to operate in a policy compliant environment. And then some of the GPOs that I think Joe articulated really well, they can oftentimes take your infrastructure out of compliance. And here's an example of one. This is the one where you have to have a strong session key. And you can see the requirement here. We had this registry setting, and the expected value was a 1. Now, when we scanned, it was actually set at 0. So we went ahead and changed this and remediated it to a 1. However, we did force GP updates to see if group policy had a different value. And sure enough, it did. It actually overwrote the desired policy value back to a 0. So this is an example of group policy taking the asset out of compliance. And we encourage our customers to either flatten their whole GPO structure or simply stop using it for STIG compliance requirements or CIS requirements. And that means you can reduce your STIG or GPO conflict reporting. In fact, I can show you some of the items here, just the GPO defects that could take the asset out of compliance. And there are 4 here that could take this asset out of compliance. And for some of our customers that need to accredit to a certain level, this could be the difference between pass or fail. So this is really important that we understand the limitations of GPOs. But basically, this is what ConfigOS does from a policy compliance view. And then what we can do is we can output this content to different things like checklists. We can create JSONs, and those JSONs then can be presented to third-party products like SIMs. And let me show you a quick SIM view. Here's an example of a Splunk application. Now, every time we implement policy, we scan policy, remediate findings, we always create a JSON. And those JSONs then can be gathered, they can be collected, and then presented to an enterprise compliance dashboard like this for Splunk. And you can then have a dashboard view of what compliance looks like for your enterprise. And this can be all of the networks across the entire operation. You can be specific to certain networks or geographies. You can look at, have a horizontal view of specific OSs. And here is a heat map configuration of what compliance looks like over time. So you can see what's trending. You can track defects. You can assess risk. So there's lots of things that you can do here. And I will say the CISO and above leadership absolutely love all of these capabilities. But that's basically what we do with our automated STIG compliance solution, ConfigOS. We automate all of these compliance requirements. So we go back to the product, please. We can also output all of these settings to things like checklists, and you can work with some of the other third-party products for accreditation and be able to view those. But it's a very comprehensive product, and we'd love to share more information with you. But we have some time left. I wanted to open the floor, hand over back to Joe and to Jack, and be ready to take any questions.
Thanks, Nigel. One of the things I did want to point out from our services side that we get a request where we find works really well with us. You talk about in the OT, we don't do a lot of remediation. What we find, and one of the ways we use the product a lot, is we use the remediation function of ConfigOS to build a baseline image, like a hardened template for ESXi or for systems that are going to be rolled out. And then as systems are getting deployed, either in virtual machines getting spun up or new physical blocks is deployed from an ISO, they use that hardened image to do it. Then they use the scanning functionality of ConfigOS to confirm that all of the hardened settings remain in place as these various images move throughout their lifetime across the organization.
Okay. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Nigel. There were actually a couple of questions here, I see. One was, we actually got this one last seminar, last webinar as well. You know, how does the config OS contrast to doing a system hardening by hand?
Oh, that's a great question. That's primarily the reason why we created config OS, because it was almost impossible to do it manually. As I think Joe articulated really well, most customers use a combination of scripts, things like PowerShell, Ansible playbooks, and things like that. There's third-party products such as Puppet, Chef, Tanium, things like that. And then there's group policy, of course. And what you tend to have is a kind of kludge of all of these partial capabilities, and you have a less than ideal. But what is I guess the biggest issue is it's a very expensive, time-consuming. There's a whole bunch of SME specialists required, and it takes enormous amounts of time. So that's the reason we created config OS a little over 10 years ago, was to automate this whole process. What our customers tell us is that they typically see a 90% reduction in overall time, effort, and cost. And I have a study that one of the major integrators prepared that showed for approximately 2,500 assets, they were spending 16 hours per asset per year maintaining STIG compliance. Now, that translates to about 40,000 hours or 20 FTEs. With config OS, it was just 1 hour or 2 FTEs. And those 18 people that are no longer doing STIG or CIS compliance could be reallocated into much more important cyber tasks to protect the customer network. So yeah, it's a dramatic reduction in cost, Jack.
Okay.
And practically from our side, we executed a hardening the manual way to do STIG compliance for .NET, Chrome, Edge, and the Windows operating system, just building the base templates like I described. And doing that took about 50 hours, 40 to 50 hours. Now that time did involve resolving conflicts with applications. So, and of course, as it always works out, you get the error, unspecified error, which is extremely helpful in trying to figure out which one of these 400,000 settings you applied is the one causing the problem. So like Nigel said, you get more proficient in this, you start to see the same applications over and over again, maybe get a little more efficient. But yeah, practically doing one was about 40 to 50 hours.
Oh, very good. Okay, good. Here's one other one. If not in compliance, when should you go to STIG versus CIS?
Go ahead and take the first stab at that one, Nigel, because I know we have slightly different opinions there.
Oh, I thought you were going to speak. Yeah, I think my sense is that to use your expression, if you have a sort of defense sort of adjacent sort of organization, it probably makes sense to do STIG related policy compliance. But I would look into the standards and see which one makes the most sense to you. What you will find is that many of the policy control settings are remarkably similar. What tends to happen are the policy controls for CIS tend to be that there's more of them. So for say a Windows 10 OS, there's probably about 400 or 500 control settings, whereas the STIG is about 300. So there's things like that to bear in mind. But then the Defense Department has more checklist type reporting technologies that I think are helpful. But then CIS has a whole range of different tools and technologies and industry capabilities as well. So horses for courses would be my recommendation there.
And like I said in the presentation itself, our experience has been the closer you get to that level 0 of the Purdue model, where it's really devices, sensors, level 1 with the PLCs and SCADA themselves, we found not so much that the policies themselves apply better as there's fewer conflicts. So I'm talking the various settings in STIG tend to work better with these OEM applications. So Studio 5000 or your panel view application, panel builder. We found that CIS, if we just carte blanche apply CIS, there's more exceptions we have to write and locate and find. And fortunately, we've found a lot of those now. Then the further up the organization you get, the closer you get to the DMZs and the corporate network, it planes out a bit, and both of them are really applicable. And then I think it's a business case decision.
Okay, thanks. Last question. This is for Nigel. What is the basis for pricing for Config OS? How is that priced?
Yes, so we have an annual subscription, which includes all of the quarterly or monthly updates from CIS and DISA, respectively. And we have a price point then for Windows Server configurations. We don't need to know which ones they are. We just need to count them. DISA for Linux assets, Microsoft Windows workstations, and then any network gear, any Cisco switches, routers, we count those for a price point as well. And from there, we'll be able to give you a kind of a ROM. And you should expect an immediate ROI. The product should pay for itself the very first time that you deploy it. So it's a very compelling proposition in our experience.
Okay, great. Those are the questions.
I'll throw my 2 cents on that. We did the hardening, and we had the manual and to compare against, and this is why we became, first a customer of SteelCloud and then later a partner. Was when we looked at the cost of SteelCloud, we literally recouped every bit of it, and then some on the very first project, just in terms of the hours saved by not doing the manual hardening. That doesn't take into account the ability to scan the environment, to schedule reports, to do subsequent remediations when there were updates within the subscription period. So I really am not exaggerating when I say the ROI can be measured in weeks.
Okay, good. Good to know. Okay, well, there's no other questions. I believe that concludes the webinar. What I am going to ask you to do is, please, at the conclusion of this webinar, you'll be proposed with a survey. I ask you to please take the survey. We use that information to help gauge the interest in this offering, as well as the value out of these webinars. So please take the survey at the conclusion of this. And we have recorded this, and all of the people that registered will be receiving a copy of this recording. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me, jack@eisinc.com, and I'll make certain that I bring in Joe and Nigel and the appropriate people. All right. Thank you so much. And this concludes our webinar.
Thank you, everybody.
Good afternoon, good evening.